Hey, what's good, Jazz fans? Welcome to Jabber Jazz, your home for ad-free, fan-driven Utah Jazz basketball talk with an analytical emphasis every week. I'm your host, Adam Bushman. You can find me on Twitter at Adam_Bushman. And today we have an awesome topic, a real interesting question to really dive into and dig through. And that is, did the Jazz choose the right direction this past offseason? Okay, and to help me answer that question and to get into all the details of it, I have Ken Clayton here with me. He's a contributor for Salt City Hoops. He's a CBA and salary cap guru. He's got all the spreadsheets, and he even tracks the Utah Jazz flights when they're on the road. Ken, am I missing anything?
That pretty much covers the things I'm probably most known for.
Well, you're a fantastic Twitter follower. As you can see in the background here, we're on YouTube. Ken is a big Jazz fan, a staple in the Twitter community, and I'm so happy to have you on, Ken. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks.
So if you like what we're doing, please, we'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast on whatever podcatcher you use, or if you're here on YouTube, we'd love for you to like the video, subscribe to the channel. Leave us a comment or review. That helps things a lot as well. And without further ado, let's Jabber Jazz. Okay, so our big question is, did the Jazz choose the right direction this offseason? And the start of this season, Ken, has kind of prompted a lot of questions surrounding the Jazz. I think even the most optimistic of us, not myself, I will admit I was pessimistic for a handful of reasons on the Jazz. To start the year, I think we all knew the Jazz had some talent, but even the most bullish, I think, far underestimated what this squad was capable of. And so a lot of questions kind of permeate around this team, and so we're going to kind of consider what kind of directions the Jazz could have gone this offseason. Anything you want to say about, I guess, the surprise the Jazz have had, the questions this season has kind of prompted thus far before we get into exact scenarios?
No, I just would say add me to the people, include me on the list of people who have been surprised. It's been, the first 10 games, I kept thinking, well, this is just that startup period, the honeymoon phase, the hammer's going to drop eventually. And, we had the 3-game losing streak, so it was a little hammer that dropped, but they still look like they're matching up with teams pretty well and the types of teams that we didn't think they would match up with.
Yeah, it's been extremely road-heavy thus far.
Yeah.
A lot of back-to-backs. They've played a lot of really good teams. And for a squad that was really only returning 3 rotation guys, in Conley, Gay, and Clarkson, who were really only returning 2 coaching staff people to the team, introducing a new head coach, and trading off your main ecosystem guys over the offseason, I think, it was reasonable to expect that, hey, with all this confluence of events, would be a recipe for a sluggish start, and it's been anything but. A really, really fun season to start. But let's rewind a little bit to the offseason. So we're going to consider 4 scenarios. There's infinite directions or permutations of where the Jazz could have gone in the offseason. But we're going to kind of concentrate on 4 of the main ones. One being the direction they actually took, right? We've seen the squad for 19 games thus far. You guys are going to be seeing this after Thanksgiving. We're sneaking in a recording here pre-Thanksgiving. But we've seen the Jazz for, a little over 25% of the season, and so that is one scenario we're considering. And then there are 3 others that we're going to consider as well. And we're going to operate off a couple assumptions, and I'm just going to refresh Ken on these assumptions here quick. The first is that, hey, even though the Jazz executed a transition to the current squad, whatever the Jazz did, it was going to be a transition of some sort. So we're going to operate on the assumption that the Jazz still hire Will Hardy. I think Quinn was going to leave no matter what. And I think we're safe to assume that. We're going to assume that the Jazz still trade Royce O'Neal. That was a flexibility move, if nothing else. The Jazz they were a little strapped with what they had asset-wise, and they needed to shake something up, so we're going to assume that still happened. We're also going to assume that the free agents the Jazz didn't bring back, Daniel House, Juancho Hernan-Gomez, Eric Paschal, they weren't shoo-in returning players, so for this exercise, we're not going to assume they came back. But had the Jazz prioritized it, hey, maybe one of them comes back, but we're not going to assume that any returned fully. And we're going to operate with full hindsight in our analysis. We're going to retain that in our back pocket. Okay, so let's talk about the first scenario. And it's really just that the Jazz stay the course. So I'm going to prep this scenario quick here. Our 9-man rotation kind of looks like the starters of Conley, Mitchell, some question mark there at the forward spot, Bogdanovich, then Gobert. And then your next 4 are Jordan Clarkson, Rudy Gay, and then someone.
Yeah.
And I think, we can kind of assume that whatever starter that was, it was probably someone on an exception, a tax exemption or biannual or something like that, whatever the Jazz had available. And then the people on the bench would have been just minimum guys. And so you can kind of see on the screen here that the Jazz, would have had, approximately 6 unprotected picks if we assume that the Oklahoma City one conveys at some point. They had the protected pick they got from Royce O'Neal, median age of 29 years old. For the 23-24 season, they had 8 guaranteed roster spots, taking up about 91% of the cap. So that's kind of the scenario we got with kind of just staying the course and really not shaking things up too much. Ken, with the assumptions we laid out and this kind of a scenario, how do you evaluate this team? What would have they been capable offensively and defensively?
Well, I think defensively is the easiest answer because as long as you have Rudy Gobert there, you probably assume you can do as well as you've done the last few years. Losing Royce O'Neal, some people would look at that and say, oh, you're hurting yourself. I'm not as big a fan of the defender Royce O'Neal was just last year. Early on in his career, a little better, but not as much last year. Your bench looks a little thin because we don't know who those 2 other guys are, and you're including Rudy Gay, who lost his position in the rotation last year. But the one reason why I have now, with the hindsight you mentioned, become more bullish on this rotation is Will Hardy.
Yeah,
we've seen Will Hardy and what he's done with kind of this ragtag group of players that was brought together via 3 or 4 trades, and you wonder what could he have done with that group. We'll never know, but that's the thing. That's the one reason I can look now at that group and say, what would Will Hardy have done with Conley, Mitchell, Bogey, Gobert, Clarkson, and whoever else? And I deliberately left Gay in the whoever else category.
Yeah, totally. I definitely do feel like the Jazz still try to play that shell a little bit. They keep Rudy at the rim, and they do try to run people off the 3-point line. I think Hardy would probably, that fresh blood, his approach, he probably gets people, at least in the early going, to lean into the chaos a little bit more, get hands on balls, that type of thing. I think with the conditioning and stuff that he stressed in training camp, he probably is able to get people to stay in front of their man a bit better than we saw last year's squad do. But on the whole, I think it's more or less the same. You had a tried and true offensive recipe, spread pick and roll, with the shooters and Gobert diving at the rim. That's been the best offense that the league has had during this Conley, Bogdanovich, Mitchell, Gobert era. And then some subtle tweaks defensively. But Ken, one thing that we've said about this current Jazz team that we have right now is just how fun a brand of basketball it is, and how, charismatic and engaging all the players are, and how they're rallying around, this style that Hardy has brought. How fun is this group if we were really just kind of staying the course, and we had, this group, and we're really just bringing in Hardy to kind of shake things up? How fun are they?
I don't think they're as fun because I think the expectations remain pretty high.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problems that the locker room had over the last year, particularly coming off the best record in the league and the loss in the Clipper series, was the weight of those expectations made the game much less fun for them internally. Not even talking about the fans. The fans will get jazzed if the wins come, but the Jazz themselves were not jazzed, and I think it was that the weight of being having that top record, bringing back the team, running it back for the third year for that group, the fifth year for a Donovan and Rudy combination. I think the weight of that really got to them. And I don't think they hated each other. I think most of that was overplayed. But I think the weight of that got to them and made the game less fun. And that hurt them as far as success as well.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned, didn't like each other and some things like that was probably overblown. You're probably right. What has been kind of reported was kind of happening towards the end of the season. Probably not any one person's fault, more just probably kind of victim of circumstance in a way that there was a level of toxicity that was kind of happening. I think Joe Ingles has commented it, post his trade. Rudy Gay and Mike Conley kind of talked about how much weight everybody was carrying around, during the media day interviews. And I don't know that Hardy, I think probably immediately there's that jolt that gets everybody, going. But, once you, perform poorly in a national TV game and everybody's just ragging on you, once, one tiff, happens between the superstars and all the rumors start flooding in, I don't know that Hardy himself really addresses, the underlying things that were kind of festering for the team in a way.
Yeah, he doesn't make the media quit asking those questions. Even if the things appear better, every time there's a game where Donovan misses Rudy on an alley-oop or doesn't make the pass at all, those questions still come up in the media session.
Yeah, precisely. What's kind of the immediate ceiling of this group, in a way? Like, hey, we're not kind of thinking long term here, but just like, hey, you mentioned it. The expectations were, hey. We just lost in the first round. We had been to the second round the previous year and lost in disappointing fashion. Expectations are we'd get back to that second round and really push the envelope to get to the conference finals. That were the expectations, but was that the ceiling of this group?
It's hard to say now because it sure seems like it was now. But for a year or year and a half, I really thought the ceiling was higher.
Yeah,
I'm not sure now. They say you can never. It's hard to ever admit you were wrong or change your mind because you have to admit you were wrong before. And I think if Lightning had stayed in the bottle just a little bit longer, if the leg sweep hadn't happened against the Pacers, those sorts of little butterfly flaps along the way, maybe this team did have a much higher ceiling than even just getting to the conference finals. But the leg sweep did happen. Donovan was out for ages, longer than it seemed like he should have been. Conley then got hurt, and after that it felt like it was in retrospect it feels inevitable that Terrence Mann was just going to blow him out of the water from the corner.
Yeah, kind of putting it in maybe Zach Lowe's terms, he talked about his championship inner circle, this group of 6 teams that he's like, hey, I trust these teams to be in play come the end of the season, for a championship. I think the Jazz with this squad probably would have been just outside of that, and I really think it probably just stems from that after, so many, I guess, missed expectations and falling short. I don't think anybody would have really trusted this group, even with Hardy in there, even with tweaks around the edges. Yeah. And there's probably an argument, and we saw it last year, that, hey, certain games may have even, had them telling themselves a story. Maybe we can't do it. Maybe they didn't even believe in themselves, when they started getting that pushback in a way.
Yeah.
How optimistic would we have been for the future of this team? We talked about the median age. We talked about how many people would have been on the roster in 2 years, how much of the cap was allocated, how many picks, we kind of had. what would have been your optimistic level for, long-term future in a way?
Oh, I think long-term future would have been pretty bearish. With so few pick assets, you've got it there, the 6 unprotected, and then the 1 from the Brooklyn, Philly, Houston, the worst of those 3. That would have been, the war chest wouldn't have changed much. Having that 1 extra pick might have helped come the deadline, but they still couldn't have traded their own pick unless they went way out into the future. So I don't think a lot of help would have been coming. You would have been, crossing your fingers with Mike Conley. It's an ironic time to say that because in the real timeline, Mike Conley's out right now.
Yeah.
You would have been relying on Bogdanovich staying healthy, which generally he has been. And then you're relying on production from the guy you don't know who it is, probably a taxpayer, mid-level exception guy, Jordan Clarkson staying, and then still you got to replenish that bench, whether you bring back 1 or 2 of those, Pascal, Hernan Gomez, whoever, and then you're filling in some minimum guys around them. So I don't know that the future looked terribly bright for that group beyond 1 or maybe 2 more years with a Hardy run with that group.
Yeah, I would totally agree. We would have essentially been in more or less the situation that the Los Angeles Lakers find themselves right now, except that we would have had a much better team, but our draft assets that would have really brought back a big impact return would have been far out in the future. And with the Los Angeles Lakers, you can make the case of, oh hey, you have arguably the best players ever lived, and you've got another worst case scenario, probably top 20, 25 player in Anthony Davis. You move those picks and get something solid, then hey, maybe you're right back into that that tier. I don't know that you can really say the same for the Jazz. I mean, yeah, we had probably 2 top 25 players, but the ceiling was, especially since the Lakers, 2 years ago secured that championship, and the Jazz, kind of flamed out in a way. So yeah, I don't think the future was bright at all. Any last things you want to say on this scenario?
No, just riffing exactly off what you just said. The only way it looked good in the future was when you pulled the plug and did exactly what they already did.
Yeah.
But as far as a really positive looking future with Rudy and Donovan still on the team, I don't think so.
So the second scenario we want to consider is that the Jazz make the Rudy trade, but they don't make the Donovan and Bojan trades in a way. And so kind of what you have in this second scenario is that you have as starters, you have Conley, Mitchell, Bogdanovich. We do get Vanderbilt from the Rudy trade. And then you've got a question mark there at center. Starting center, I should say, because the next 4, your 4 players off the bench are Clarkson. We do get Malik Beasley from that trade, Rudy Gay, and then we also get Walker Kessler. So that's kind of the rotation as it stands for this kind of a scenario. We've got some unprotected picks, 9, assuming that OKC one conveys. We've got 2 protected picks, that extra one in 2029, top 5 protected that's coming from Minnesota. Median age drops quite a bit because, no more Rudy. So now you're at 27 median age, fewer roster spots guaranteed for the 23-24 season, and a much lower percent of the cap, approximately 59% of the cap, salary cap you have allocated in guaranteed contracts in that year. So now let's cycle back through some of the similar questions. But with a big trade in Rudy, how does this team play offensively and defensively is a much bigger, question and thought exercise. What are you kind of feeling as you look at this group?
This group never did much for me because, this was, let me think. Yeah, this was an actual group that we were thinking about in real time because Rudy went first and we still had all these guys. I was always very concerned because who are you going to get to plug in for Rudy Gobert, or if you want to say that today Jared Vanderbilt is nominally a starting center, then who are you going to get to be that the 4 when all you have to go do it is the taxpayer mid-level exception? They might have been able to squeeze out a larger portion of the mid-level exception, but I'm not sure they could have. So, where are you getting something? So then you've got to hope that everything you're going to do to improve is going to be schematic. and is going to be motivation. Now, again, you've got Will Hardy in your back pocket because you already hired him. So there's probably some optimism there that I didn't know at the time. At the time, I felt like this was going to be a rough year, even with Donovan. I felt like it was going to be a little bit of a, he would feel like it was a wasted year for him because they'd be mired in kind of that 30s and 40s win area. And I don't know that my opinion has changed a whole lot, even to this point.
Yeah, I totally hear you. This was an intriguing group for me because I saw Beasley with how prolific a shooter he was. I kind of saw him as a potential long-term fit with Donovan Mitchell in the two starting guard spots. You put the ball in Donovan Mitchell's hand as the point guard with, such a dynamic shooter and someone who's active defensively. Not saying he's anything special, but he's active.
Yeah.
I thought that was really intriguing. But that big hole in the center spot, it really kind of how you play on offense and defense really is kind of predicated on who you get there. If you get kind of a rim protecting center who can't really shoot, well then, hey, that affects a ton of spacing concerns with, Jared Vanderbilt. I know he's hit a couple threes this year, but he's not affecting spacing or gravity. And that's something that Donovan would really require. But then if you get kind of like a Kelly Olynyk type, who can shoot from the three, then you're probably doing some pick and pops. Maybe you're relying on some passing, and so maybe it works. But ultimately, I think they do probably try to lean into that chaos defensively in a way, but still you're lacking some personnel to do it. I mean, we can see just how vital Lauri Markkanen is to that chaos.
Yeah.
As a secondary rim protector, those long arms. He's been very, very quick on his feet out on the perimeter. You don't have him in this scenario. And so really, I think it's kind of like the worst of all worlds in a way defensively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I just think having that huge question mark, where are you going to fill a top 15 to 20, somewhere in that range player in the NBA, it was going to be tough. And apologies to the guys we got in the Rudy Gobert trade, but the best of the guys we got came in that other trade that wouldn't have happened in this scenario. And I think it just would have left the cupboard a little too bare. Out of these four scenarios, I think this is probably my fourth place finish. Yeah.
Yeah, so how fun is this group in a way? Because, I think you still get a lot of Malik Beasley's, incredible three-point shooting, Jared Vanderbilt, being that Energizer Bunny type, creating chaos and things. So how fun is this group though? Because you are missing Lauri Markkanen. You don't have Sexton and some of these other pieces that we're enjoying this season. How fun does this group really become?
I think it's pretty fun. I mean, just from a fan in the stands, because you're still going to have these guards and the shooters. But I think that's where I didn't see this group, because the other piece that we don't have on the graphic is Talen Horton-Tucker, because presumably they might have still flipped Beasley for him or Beverly for him, although maybe not.
Sure.
I would kind of just posit that they would have, only because he was another small guard, and I know THT is a guard, but he's also a guard who's really long, and he can, in a pinch, play forward better than Patrick Beverly can. So, if they would have done that, you still got some guys flying around. You've got shooters for days, and Conley, Mitchell, Bogey, Beasley, Clarkson, not so much THT. So you got some fun, but I don't think the fun translates as much to wins in this scenario.
Yeah, I would agree. Especially, if you're really just using an exception for that center spot. Mm-hmm. I just don't think you get someone who spaces in the way that this heavy a guard-laden roster would need to take advantage of how much shooting we have and to be able to leverage Donovan in the best way, getting downhill out of the pick and roll and getting to the hoop. if you don't have a Kelly Olynyk in there or that type who can, yeah, I guess make it so that there's more than enough gravity, even with Jared Butler on the floor. I think that they're good, but ultimately the ceiling's, far too low for what we would have wanted. And ultimately, as you mentioned, wins are what ultimately makes it fun, because as awesome as highlights are in the moment, when the final score is showing your team in the loss column, that's where that wasn't really that fun kind of stings.
Right.
What's kind of like, I guess, the immediate ceiling and contender window for this team?
I think this team, to me, looks like a play-in team. And maybe they get in the bottom, the 7 and 8. Although I say that thinking about it, how I thought about the world in the offseason, where I thought Golden State was still good. And I thought to some of these teams, I mean, that's the crazy thing about this NBA season, even 20 games in, is we still really don't know even if you take the Jazz out, we don't know the landscape of the rest of the West. Because the teams that I would have penciled in Golden State as a top 4 probably.
Oh, yeah.
And right now I don't have it up, but they're, I think they're playing at best, maybe even outside the play-in right now. And just beyond that, just not looking really good. So you got Golden State, at that point I would have said they were a play-in team and maybe they sneak in and face the 1 seed or the 2 seed. Now that we know that Golden State's not as powerful and some of these other teams aren't playing as well, maybe you'd revise that. But as far as what I would have thought in the offseason, I would have seen this as maybe a play-in team and not had a lot of hope beyond getting into the first round. And that's probably about it.
Yeah, I assumed that the Jazz would probably make it to the first round series and be somewhat competitive, lose in a 4-1, 4-2 fashion. Mostly I kind of thought that, the bench depth was pretty good.
Yeah.
And we've seen how, vital the bench has been this year. Our starting lineup has really only been about league average, and it's really been the bench unit that's, been really running opposing benches off the floor. And this bench is pretty strong. You've got Kessler, who does a ton of tremendous high value things each night, and you've got enough scoring and shooting around there. And if you're Will Hardy and empowering this group, hey, maybe that does enough for you to carry you throughout a regular season. But ultimately, the buck's going to stop there, because that's not a winning formula. A super strong bench and a weak, hole-laden starting unit,
right.
That's a recipe for disaster when you're facing what would likely be a Denver, a Dallas, a Golden State in your first round series. I mean, this group would have just gotten picked apart.
Right. I absolutely think so.
So this one is also interesting because you do get those 3 unprotected, 1 protected pick from Minnesota. You got Kessler, you have Vanderbilt, and so they're you also have Beverly, or if you do the THT trade, then you got Talen Horton-Tucker. So you've got some kind of middle tier salaries. You've got a young guy, and you've got these picks, and so. There is this idea about how are you optimistic for the future? What would you have been thinking if the Jazz rolled this roster through? What would you have been thinking for the future?
Well, in the immediate future, when this happened, I thought that they could maybe use some of those assets to bring in another star next to Donovan, and I think they did try that for a short period of time and didn't find much luck there. That said, that was looking to find lightning in the bottle that day.
Yeah.
But looking into the future, I think they would have had opportunities, much greater opportunities, to use the extra 4 picks and some more tradable pieces and contracts. Going forward, you'd think that they would have had more flexibility, going into the trade deadline next off season and then beyond, that they wouldn't have had in option 1.
Yeah, totally. I mean, given these assets that you have, and you try it out for the start of the season. And as the trade market develops, and we've seen it, in real time now, if we kind of, take off the past goggles and we look, John Collins is being talked about, and Jazz reportedly have interest. Read into that how you will. But the idea being that, hey, you probably could have, taken advantage of some of what was out there. You bring in a John Collins, hey, that suddenly makes you not so guard heavy and distributes, the offensive load throughout the roster. Maybe you make Indiana an offer they can't refuse for a Miles Turner, for example, and you extend him. All of a sudden, he's locked up for 4 years, young enough to, bridge this timeline with Donovan Mitchell. So I would have been reasonably optimistic that we had options, that we got younger. But it wasn't for certain, and ultimately this season would have been disappointing relative to expectations because we still have a top 20 player in Mitchell, but we have the flexibility to make the subsequent seasons better. But I still kind of think that contender window was still probably only 2 years if we hadn't just absolutely sold Donovan on a relationship with Hardy, on bringing in, guys he'd liked that were really vaulting us into contention in a different way. I still think that clock would have put just tons of pressure on the organization.
No, I totally agree. Your time period with Don is 2 years, because then at that point, if he's not going to extend, then you've got to look to trade him. Your time frame with Bogdanovich and Conley is a similar time frame. So even though you've added some youth into the mix, those three players, you have a limited runway with which to try to go out and win big. And we differ a little bit on this, but I don't think they would have won as big as they wanted to.
Oh, yeah, you're probably right. I think they probably make a playoff series.
Yeah.
But that could have still been through the avenue of play-in, as was your kind of scenario. Yeah. Or maybe you just get lucky with tiebreakers, or last second you win one game and suddenly you're sixth. Are you really sixth? Technically. Right. That type of thing. Let's talk about scenario 3. So this is kind of the inverse. You keep Rudy Gobert, you don't make that first big trade, and instead you make the Donovan trade. And so in this kind of a scenario, you have Conley, Clarkson, Bogdanovich, Lauri Markkanen from the Donovan trade, and Gobert as your starters. Then you have Sexton, Gay, question mark. And so this one, as opposed to the Donovan one, you don't have a hole in the starting lineup, but you've got some depth concerns on the bench that you got to figure out. And those are likely minimum signings or such. But some other figures, again, you have 9 unprotected picks, assuming the OKC one conveys. You are 1 protected pick lighter. You do have some swaps, but we won't talk about those too much. Median age is still at 29. You've got guaranteed roster spots of 8 for 23-24 season, and you're back up to 87% of the cap by offloading Mitchell, because you're bringing back those guaranteed contracts with Sexton extending, and then what we have in Lauri Markkanen. So that's the third scenario. Let's circle back. Offense and defense. What are you kind of thinking on this group?
Boy, I looked at defense first, and I started on the right-hand side of the starters, and I thought, your defense is pretty solid, because I saw Gobert and even Markkanen. He's been a surprise defensively. Just part of that's just the fact that he's a 7-footer who takes up space, and much of the time he's playing kind of the 3. But then I kept going to the left, and I was like, well,
tapers off there, doesn't it?
But maybe in the Will Hardy world and the chaos and if he still felt like he could instill that, I think he could. I think the two things he's instilled on the defensive end, the chaos and the let's try to get some steals, let's try to get some deflections, which, let's not make this a referendum on Quinn Snyder, but I never understood why you've got Rudy Gobert back there, why you played so conservative out on the perimeter. But I think, maybe I'm not seeing it, but maybe they could be close to as good defensively. I mean, I do think they could be pretty good, because there's this Rudy Gobert guy, and he wipes out a lot of mistakes. So, the three starters aren't any worse. I mean, I don't think Clarkson is any worse a defender than Donovan Mitchell. At least the effort we saw last season. So maybe I'm being a little hard on this group defensively. Maybe it could have been comparable to last season, perhaps.
Yeah, this one, so the Jazz, I think they were 10th or 11th per cleaning the glass defensively last year. And I think I probably would have expected them to be 7th to 10th ranked defensively here, primarily because if we're playing the way that's best optimized Rudy, he's at the rim, and he's able to affect so many shots. But when we're facing opposing 5-out lineups and Rudy gets pulled out, and we need some weak side help, we have a very fleet-footed 7-footer, who has shown some real propensity for just disruption. The block totals, or averages aren't blowing us away. Neither the steal totals, but just everything in the aggregate just points to a lot more disruption than we had seen in last year's roster behind Rudy. And so I think that does quite a bit. And with just that little jolt that Hardy's bringing of, hey guys, don't be afraid to keep your hands up in passing lanes and to, jump a passing lane if you've got a good read on it, that type of thing. I think that inflates the defense a little bit. On offense, I think we play quite a bit similar to how we did, and in a regular season, I don't think you're number one, but I think you're somewhere 5 to 10 probably, just with how prolific as shooters we got, and we do have people who can take off the dribble, and we do have Rudy Gobert attacking the rim and lobs, but as soon as you get to the playoffs, we don't have a guy who is that special athletically or that special of a shot maker to when things bog down, hey, I'm going to go get us a bucket or that sort of thing. So I think it's another recipe for regular season success that ultimately comes short come playoffs.
Yeah, that's probably true because I think, you've got Jordan Clarkson and Colin Sexton there who can do that in spots, let's say, but they're not the sort of guy, they're not Donovan Mitchell. So they're not the guy in the playoff series where you're just going to get on his back and ride. Although, give Clarkson credit, he was probably the best offensive player in last year's playoff series, but that's part of the reason why it was a loss.
Right, precisely, yeah. So the fun question with this group is pretty interesting. Where do you kind of go in terms of fun for this group?
I don't know. I think you look at this team and you almost feel like you got Markkanen in there, but other than that, your starting lineup feels a little bit like running it back. So you're probably excited as a fan. And again, like I said earlier, winning brings fun, but I don't think this group feels as fun as some of the other ones did that we talked about earlier.
Sure. I think this one feels like it has a little more fun potential because as opposed to the Donovan scenario, or I guess where you made the Rudy trade and you've built around Donovan, that scenario too, as opposed to that one, we don't have like a real high usage player offensively on this in this scenario. Markkanen's only using 17 true shooting attempts per game. In what we actually know from this season, that would have been less in this kind of a scenario because Bogdanovich would have been, using up quite a few possessions himself. But I still think you get a lot more spread and diversity than you do in scenario 2. So I think you see a lot of good passing. I do think you see a lot of people involved. I think that would be pretty fun. But one of the most fun components of this season has been Lauri's ascension, and I don't think you get that to the extent we've seen. I think you're closer to Cleveland, Lauri Markkanen, than what we have gotten, which has been a lot closer to Eurobasket, Lauri Markkanen.
So you say that, I'm assuming here, you're saying that because maybe with Bogdanovich in there, Lauri's not getting the ball quite as much, or that's impacting his ability to impact the game. It's possible.
Well, one other reason I kind of say that too is a lot of the extra volume that Lauri's been getting have been on those cuts. And, setting those picks where, you've got a really good passer right up above the key, who's, looking for handoffs with guards slinging around the perimeter. And then here comes Lauri Markkanen in a short curl diving to the rim, and Olynyk can make that pass. I don't know if we get that quite with Rudy. I don't know if he's as prolific hitting that pass, and I don't know if we have the spacing necessary to get in those looks. That was kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, okay. That's fair.
So what's the immediate ceiling of this group in a way?
I think this group, I should be prepared for these questions by now because I've been through them twice before. I think this group, to me, has a slightly higher ceiling than the last group. I would think get playoffs, I would expect a certainty. And I think advancing into the second round, as long as you're getting what you hope to get out of, particularly when I look at this group, look at getting it out of the bench, getting it out of Colin Sexton, and those 3 question marks next to him. And yes, I just called Rudy Gay a question mark. Because,
yes.
So that's where this group does suffer a little bit is what's coming off the bench. And so that's going to be the thing that could hold them back, including in the playoffs, but it'll become less important in the playoffs. And so I think this is a group that could sneak in and get into the second round. And then after that, just roll the dice and see where you land. That's certainly better than I would have expected in the off season, because I didn't know, which Lauri Markkanen we had acquired, but now, because we're using the benefit of hindsight, which were your rules, and knowing what kind of a Lauri Markkanen we got, I think there would be some more upside to the playoffs, this group versus the one we talked about before.
Yeah, I would probably agree. I could see them getting to a second round. I think that's where it kind of bogs down for me, because even if I kind of assume that Lauri is this player, I personally am bearish on him being like a number 1 option, like an all NBA level. I'm not quite there on him yet, particularly just because, he doesn't self-create enough, and he doesn't have enough volume potential, to use up enough possessions where, hey, nobody else has got it. You could just force feed him to death and, throw any matchup at him. He'll get attempts, and it's just whether he's making or missing. I don't quite feel that yet from Lauri, and I think that's probably what you need to be really competitive in a second round series, where you're certainly playing a Phoenix or a Golden State type. Who've got, several players who any given night can do that for you, probably.
Right. No, that's true. You'd probably need a good matchup to go. I'm probably getting a little too bullish, but you'd need a good matchup to be able to go beyond the second round with this crew.
So let's think about contender window, because, you have supplanted, a young superstar Donovan with a young star in Lauri Markkanen. And you got Sexton off the bench. But you do have a lot of salary cap tied up. We do have some extra assets coming in from the Donovan trade in terms of picks. Contender window, what are you thinking on this one?
Probably similar to the last one. I think we said a 2-year window on the last one. Similar here, depending on how you trade out of that window. But for this immediate group, how much longer is Rudy going to maintain his level of defensive prowess? How much longer is Bogdanović going to, continue to play at his level? Mike Conley, that same problem has been in all 4 of these scenarios. You can't count on that forever. You do have a Colin Sexton as a backup plan there if that materializes to where he can really more truly play the point guard minutes. And then you've got Clarkson, who probably has a couple or 2 or 3 or 4 maybe good years left in him. But yeah, you're probably still looking at a 2-year window, because at least 2 of these guys might be falling off by the end of that. And so unless you flip them for something better, you do have the extra picks though, so you've got that going for you. But you're probably having that 2-year contender window anyway with this group. Yeah,
with Rudy, it's so interesting because I 100% got the sense that he was interested to stay around as long as we wanted him.
Yeah.
And so, if you do move off Mitchell and you kind of are retooling around Rudy in a way, it almost kind of feels like you have almost like a 1 to 3 year window where it could just be 1 year if all of a sudden, Gobert just loses 5 to 10% off everything. And then all of a sudden, it's a pretty steep decline. And then at that point, like, he's probably untradeable given the contract.
Right.
And so it's really hard to pivot out of it. So that one's really interesting. Like, it could have been slightly extended or just super, super shortened. And then you're probably stuck in, quote, purgatory for a while trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I think the Rudy problem too, maybe that's not the best word because, I think Jazz fans, the vast majority of us love Rudy. But
yes.
the problem was those big numbers on the back years of his contract and the mystery of how long can he keep this up at this level. Because like you said, if he even loses 5 to 10% of what he does, that number goes up 8% every year. So you're really finding yourself in a negative every time, whenever that happens.
Yeah, as far as optimism for the future, you do have the Donovan picks, as you mentioned. But, this contract for Rudy's kind of clouding things. Mm-hmm. How optimistic would you have been?
The 87% of the cap is probably the biggest figure there, is that Rudy's still clogging up that cap sheet. As long as he's good, you're in good shape. But I think, even the team must have realized that, that was going to, even if he's still good, he can only play one position. He can only play 32 minutes a night or 36 in the playoffs. So he's taken up such a huge portion of the cap, at least through this season and one more, and then maybe the cap goes up. But just that percentage was going to get to be a problem, because then you're just every year you're going shopping with your taxpayer mid-level exception, and you just can't do much shopping when that's all you have in your wallet.
Yeah, that's a really apt metaphor. And I kind of feel like the Jazz would have been almost like armstrung into trying to execute another star trade. Just saying, hey, we're locked into this window, and it could go really well if Rudy's stays productive for these 3 years, or it could go really poorly if he's only productive for 1 year. I almost feel like they would have been kind of forced in a way to parlay a lot of those Donovan assets to try to get, an aging star or someone who's disgruntled in a situation. Maybe you're Jimmy Butler in a way, and then you're adding a second, oh, hey, hopefully this all goes right, cross fingers. And if it's great, it's great, but it could just go terribly, terribly awry. So this is probably the one that had me least optimistic, because it gave me the feeling that that while we had some flexibility, the flexibility was similar to kind of the Lakers in a way. Every avenue was tempting us to mortgage it in a sense. Right. So let's move on to our final scenario, which honestly is going to go pretty quick, because it's the scenario we've played out for the last 3 dozen games or so, and it is the full blow up. It's Mike Conley, Jordan Clarkson, Lauri Markkanen, Jared Vanderbilt, Kelly Olynyk, with Sexton, Beasley, THT, Gay, Kessler. And with this one, we've got 12 unprotected picks, assuming we convey one to OKC. We've got 2 protected picks. We've got several swaps, median age of 26, only 7 guaranteed roster spots for the 23-24 season, and only 58% of the cap guaranteed in that ceiling too. We don't have to talk about offense or defense or anything like that with this group, because we've seen exactly how it's played out. But what do you feel like is the immediate ceiling for this group now that you've seen them for a little while?
Probably the immediate ceiling, if I'm pretty bullish, is I think getting into the playoffs and maybe pulling off a first round, but I would probably still guess it's an upset because I'm going to guess they finish in the bottom half of the eight team playoff field. But even if they're in the top half, I think that's a high end for this team, even though as we speak on November 22nd, we're talking about the top team in the Western Conference. Obviously, I've raised my floor for this team quite a bit since the start of the season, but I haven't raised it to the point that I think they're going to be, number one, number two, that type of a seed in the conference. Yeah. I think eventually we're going to see, and we've already started to see a little bit of slowdown in the wins, and now with Mike Conley out for who knows how long exactly, it obviously hurt them against the Clippers last night. So I think that's probably where I would put them is a first round possibility of a win, but that's about it.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think average scenario is you're competitive in a first round series. You're going 6-7 games and things break right. You win the series, things break unfortunate, you lose, but it's competitive nonetheless. I would agree there. As far as a contender window for this squad, I don't know if you're here, but I wouldn't say the window is open yet.
No. And
that's why it feels like the window, could begin at any moment, depending on how the Jazz use the assets. But then because you've got Lowry at 25 years old, Kessler at 21, Sexton at 23, and all reasonable contracts, it could open and extend out for quite a long time. That's how I feel. Maybe I'm leading you on a little bit, but that's how I feel.
No, I think all through the offseason, or at least once they had traded Gobert and Mitchell, the team's brain trust, Justin Zanuck and Danny Ainge, said, our goal is to open the next window. They didn't say, we have opened the next window. So I think they're fully aligned with us, even though we've seen some signs that they did a better job than maybe even they knew they did. I don't think if we got Justin Zanuck or Danny Ainge on the phone right now, if we got them in on the third window in this podcast and said, is the window open? They'd probably laugh us off the phone. They'd be like, no, of course it's not open. We'll know the window opens when there's a big move, a big move with a star coming in. We obviously had two big moves in the offseason, but they were going the other direction. Yeah. So we'll know there's a big move when there's a big move of somebody coming in, when the draft happens, and I don't think Victor Wembanyama is in the cards at this point, but when there's some talent coming in the draft that gives us real reason to be optimistic, or I guess that's probably where most of it'll be. The Jets just really aren't a free agent market. But those two things are going to happen, and I mean, eventually those are going to happen, and we're going to realize they just threw the window open, and then we can talk about how long it will remain open. But until it opens, I don't know that answer.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as far as optimism, you touched on it a little bit. I agree that this window opens and extends, depending on that talent. And we have a ton of picks. We have an exceptional foundation, given the amount of assets we have. One of the best combos in the league as far as, the talent already on the roster and the amount of draft capital we have and flexibility, like probably the best combo in the league, frankly. Yet we're missing what makes a true contender, that top 10 to 15 player, that number one option. We don't have one yet. And as much equity as we have in the young guys in the roster and in all those picks, it's kind of like equity in your house. It's fake in a way, it can ebb and flow at any time. And once it's kind of parlayed into something, it's really only that equity in a sense. So that's the only kind of reservation I have as far as, saying how optimistic I am for the future is until we have that guy, it's hard to say exactly, when and for how long we could actually, contend as, Justin Zanuck and Danny Ainge and Ryan Smith said at the beginning of the season that, hey, our ultimate goal is the championship. We've been really good for a long time, but we don't want to just be really good. And so hitting that clock on really contending requires that number one guy, and we don't have it yet. Maybe Markkanen turns into it. That would be fantastic. But until that happens, we're kind of in wait and see mode.
Yeah, I think it's more likely he settles into a second guy on a team, that sort of thing. As great as he's been, I mean, it's no knock on him. But I think that as you were talking about those assets, the thought hit me that you can only spend them once, which we've heard a lot out of the Lakers this off season and season, but that's not really true with the Jazz. The Lakers can only spend those 2 picks once because they only have 2 picks.
Yeah,
the Jazz could literally trade a 27 and a 29 twice, because they have the Minnesota and the Cleveland 27 and 29, and they have other options too. They could trade 2 2023 first round picks today if they wanted.
Yep.
So they're just so set up to be able to wheel and deal when there's something they think is worth going and wheeling and dealing for.
So now we've ran through all the scenarios. We've talked about the intricacies of what they look like in the immediate present and what the prospects look like going forward. I want you to really think back at the time when all this uncertainty, we knew a transition was about to happen. What direction did you feel like was the best at the time, and why? And I'll pose my answer afterwards.
Okay, so before they did anything, what did I think they should do?
Yeah, still operating under the assumptions of Hardy and the O'Neal trade, but technically these 4 options are ahead of us. If you kind of analyze yourself, back then, which one would you have wanted at the time?
Now I can answer this pretty easily because I believe I did a podcast at the time and I gave my answer. So at the time, I thought the best solution forward for the Jazz was to keep Donovan and Rudy and give it a try with Will Hardy. I mean, I probably thought this even before we knew whether it was going to be Quinn Snyder or Will Hardy. And that said, I thought they would I thought the market would be a little kinder as far as swapping out some of the other pieces.
Oh yeah.
And when that didn't materialize, I mean, with hindsight, that changes my answer. But at the time, I thought, could we swap out a Conley? Could we swap out a Bogdanovich? Could we swap out an O'Neal, which they did, although not for a player? And what can we bring in to try one more look with these 2, top 20 to 25 players? And but the market just, I guess, from everything we understand, was not there to be able to deal Mike Conley with his 2 years left on his contract, and we kind of saw what they got out of Bogdanovich. Wasn't super exciting, and even though it had a good period for the first 10 games of the season with Kelly Olynyk shooting 70-something% from 3, it's still not that exciting.
Yeah, I'm probably right there with you. If I really think back to what I wanted, I think I really wanted to just try again because we had 2 top 25 players in hand, and they weren't some potential or some future horizon. They were our present, and it either works or doesn't with those 2. And since we had them, I felt like, we had to just try again and hope to tinker around the margins. And now in hindsight, Hardy is a much bigger tinker than I had anticipated. Yeah. And so, that does get me pretty intrigued. But, if we couldn't, have that scenario, if we had to make a bigger transition, then I do think I wanted to, go full blow up, just because I was pretty bearish on Donovan returning the players that we needed to surround Rudy, and I was bearish on Rudy returning the amount of picks we would need. That ultimately proved not to be true, but that's what I thought. I'm like, there's no way we're going to get the amount of draft capital we would need to really extend this thing out and tailor the perfect roster to Donovan. Didn't turn out that way, but that's what I thought at the time. Right. Now, with perfect hindsight, after we ran through this whole thing, did the Jazz choose the right direction from your estimation?
I mean, when I look at the numbers on the graphic as you've laid them out, you certainly have to feel pretty optimistic about what they've done. They've knocked 3 years off the median age. They've added a total of 7 picks, protected or unprotected, just disregarding that for a minute. They've really given themselves an opportunity to go out and grab the next guy that's available, that if they're interested. I mean, the very next guy that's available, I saw there was a discussion going around it about Kyrie Irving. Should the Jazz go after him? I'm not sure the Jazz would be terribly interested in Kyrie Irving at this point, but, if they wanted him, I'll bet there's a deal there that works because the Jazz have the right kind of contracts. They have the right kind of picks. I just don't know if that's where they want to spend them.
Yeah, I think the Jazz made the right decision as well. I mean, we've seen Donovan really explode in Cleveland, but if you look at the numbers adjusted for role, he's played a lot more point guard than he did with the Jazz. So that's inflated some things to a certain extent. And he's played 5 more minutes per game than he did with the Jazz. So if you were really adjust for all those things, he's about the same player, a little more efficient. Rudy, I think I haven't watched enough to see if he's regressed that 5% that we were worried about. But just looking at impact on the team and some of his traditional numbers, it appears that may have happened. And I do 100% believe that the clock was on for Donovan. I don't care what people say. I think he was planning a transition in his career, which he has the utmost right to do. And I think it behooved the Jazz to kind of get ahead of that and not be strapped or kind of cornered into something that was going to put you behind the 8 ball going into your next transition. So I think the Jazz played their cards right ultimately. I am intrigued by some of these scenarios and what they would have looked like, but ultimately, I think they probably chose the right direction.
Well, write it down for today, and then in 6 months you can have another podcast and see if you changed your mind.
That's right. Well, Ken, any last thoughts on the Jazz? I mean, we've talked really kind of 30,000-foot view, and we've talked about the future and the past, but one of the lessons I've kind of learned from just how much turmoil the franchise has been over the last 6 months is let's just enjoy the moment. Let's just enjoy, what we have. And what have been kind of the joys you've found with this season?
Well, you mentioned one of them, which was, where did this Lauri Markkanen come from? And I mean, you can draw a line from his Eurobasket performance to this, but the whole time I was watching Eurobasket and knowing he was a member of the Jazz, I didn't expect that Lauri Markkanen was going to translate back to the NBA, and really he mostly has. So that's been exciting. It's been really interesting, and this I would never have predicted I would say this, but it's been interesting to get to see a different side and maybe a little more effective version of Talen Horton-Tucker.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I thought I didn't value Patrick Beverley super highly, and I still questioned that trade.
Yeah.
And, well, I should say this. I didn't value a 34-year-old Patrick Beverley very highly, and then I still questioned that trade. But you get a 21-year-old who the first time that he came in and he was effectively the third-string point guard, I tweeted kind of like, whose idea is this? What kind of idiot are you? And not saying that directly to Will Hardy, but I was just thinking, what's going on here? And he has not been a perfect point guard, but he's been, for a third-string point guard, he's been effective, and that's been a surprise to me. So those are a couple of the kind of small stories on a player level that have kind of jumped out. Malik Beasley has also been, because the few things I knew about him, besides the fact that he could shoot, he had the legal troubles and that, and I think he's been a breath of fresh air. And we'll see if he ever gets to fulfill his goal of being an all-star on and off the court, as Craig Bolerjack reminds us every single game.
Oh, Bowler.
Yeah.
Any comments you have on Will Hardy? A lot was made of towards the end of last season, oh, hey, should the Jazz move on from Quinn? Is it time? Ultimately, he felt like it was time for him, even though, we've heard from Danny Ainge and Ryan Smith that they really wanted him to come back. And then the Jazz took a chance on youngest coach in the league, but somebody who had risen from video coordinator to being one of Pop's stars, and then moved on to the Boston Celtics and immediately went to the finals.
Right.
And then we've kind of seen what he's actually done with the group. What are your thoughts on Will Hardy, and how do you feel about this kind of transition as one of, in franchise history, one of the few coaching moves we've ever done?
Yeah. He's been, again, much, much better than expected. And I didn't expect that he wasn't going to be good, but he was a blank slate. And so you look at that and think, I'm sure he's good because to some extent people are saying he's got a good basketball mind, and he's been around the right sorts of people, and he was a part of a Boston team that went to the finals. But yeah, I think the reviews on him, from what I understand internally in the team, and just today there was a tweet, and I can't begin to tell you who tweeted it, but just talking about how he's doing things on the court, or having the team do things on the court that nobody has done before. And I probably couldn't even begin to tell you schematically what they're talking about, but yeah, he seems to be right there. In fact, it's funny that he and Joe Mazzulla, the two assistant coaches for Boston last year, their teams have the top records in each of the two conferences. It's less of a far cry for Boston because they were a finals team last year, but
right.
He's also been a great story to the season. Probably should have listed him ahead of Malik Beasley and some of those other guys.
Well, Ken, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you joining the podcast. Do you have any exciting things that you want to promote, related to your work at Salt City Hoops, or just, some exciting travel plans that you have coming up? You're a big travel bug, and you document all of that for us on Twitter.
Wow. Well, I hate to disappoint, but I'm a pretty infrequent writer on Salt City Hoops, and I don't have anything in the pipeline. I occasionally podcast with my brother. We haven't even talked about a podcast recently.
Yep, I'm still waiting for one. And
believe it or not, I have no travel plans booked at this point, so I really need to get on the stick, because that was the worst answer to a question I've ever heard, and I feel like I've really let you down.
Well, let's see if we can bring you back on, towards the start of next year, February, March, and see if those answers may have shifted. Well, thanks again, Ken, so much. Please give him a follow. You'll be able to see his Twitter handle on the screen if you're on YouTube, or in the description below if you're on the podcast. Please give Ken a follow. Thanks so much, man.
Thank you for having me.